what if the history of science isn't quite as, well, linear as we usually think? What if, maybe buried beneath the foundational concepts we learn, there's a forgotten idea, a different way of seeing the universe that maybe was deliberately swept aside?
That's a provocative start.
And what if that forgotten idea actually holds a surprising key, a key to understanding light, energy, the very space around us? Get ready, because today we're diving into a really fascinating text you've brought to us.
Yes, and it definitely presents a radical view. I'd even say controversial regarding physics history.
Okay, so what are we looking at here?
Well, it's a deep dive into a narrative that's, part historical detective story, part philosophical debate, and actually part proposal for a kind of alternative physics model.
An alternate model.
Yeah, the author argues that a critical discovery was misunderstood, maybe even suppressed, and that this historical misstep, well, it sent modern physics down a path that makes some fundamental phenomena seem far more complex than they perhaps need to be.
And it's not just equations we're talking about, right? This text seems to weave together historical figures, pivotal moments in the lab, long-running philosophical battles.
And even some pretty surprising interpretations of religious texts, yes.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack this dense, compelling material. We'll go section by section, pulling out the most potent insights the author wants us to consider.
Sounds good.
We're going to trace a story from, early scientific curiosity about electricity and magnetism. Witness a moment of accidental genius.
Oersted, presumably.
Exactly. Explore a centuries-long conflict between matter and idealism. Follow the rise and, the apparent fall of a really fundamental concept, the ether.
Right.
And finally, contrast the modern physics picture of light with an older, ether-based explanation the author is proposing here.
It's definitely a journey that challenges assumptions. It asks you, the listener, to look at the familiar world through a very different lens. This isn't just a recap. We're going to dig into why the author makes these claims, how he connects the dots, and what implications he sees in all this.
Precisely. It's going to be complex, maybe surprising, perhaps even a bit mind-bending in places, but we're going to break it down and make it as clear as we can. So settle in. Get ready to reconsider the very fabric of reality, maybe, and let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this grand narrative. The text starts by taking us way, way back, reminding us that, humanity's been captivated by electricity and magnetism forever.
Since antiquity, really. Lightning, magnets, attracting things, these were deep mysteries.
But figuring out the fundamental nature of these forces, the why behind them, that was the real mountain to climb.
Indeed. And the source highlights some early thinkers who really grappled with this. It mentions Mikhail Lomonosov, a prominent Russian academic in the mid-18th century. He had a rather unified view, it seems.
Unified how?
Well, back in 1756, he proposed that both static electricity and light were caused by the motion of particles in a luminiferous ether.
Ah, so the ether concept was already there pretty early on. Lomonosov saw this ether as a pervasive, invisible substance filling all space, but distinct from regular matter.
And crucially, he didn't just say ether exists. He actually theorized it could have different kinds of motion, and these different motions explain different phenomena.
Like what?
He talked about linear motion as a current, oscillatory motion, like a wave for light, and also rotational motion around an axis or a center. So you have a single medium, but its varied movements could explain multiple forces. Quite elegant, really.
Yeah, like an early stab at a unified field theory. But electricity had other explanations floating around too, right? The text mentions Coulomb.
Right. Charles Coulomb, late 18th century, famous for Coulomb's law describing the force between charges. He leaned more towards the idea of two distinct electrical fluids present in all bodies.
Okay, so neutral bodies had a balance, and being charged meant having too much or too little of one fluid. Simple, maybe, but perhaps not capturing the full picture.
And throughout all this, magnetism just remained stubbornly mysterious. Why did magnets work? What was that invisible connection? It just didn't seem to fit neatly into those electrical fluid models.
Which brings us to a really central figure in this text's story, Hans Christian Ørsted.
Yes, and the author portrays him as a very deep thinker, not just a lab scientist, but also a philosopher, influenced by people like Schelling, and significantly, a devoutly religious man.
And that combination was important.
The author argues it was key. Ørsted believed in a single underlying principle for everything, a fundamental prima materia. And this conviction led him to hypothesize remarkably early, around 1812, that electricity and magnetism had to be linked. They must spring from that same fundamental root.
But for years, that link was just an idea, right? Nobody, not even Oersted, could actually show it experimentally. It was just a philosophical prediction.
Exactly. Until that famous, seemingly accidental moment in 1820, Oersted was giving a lecture demonstration, apparently just showing how to heat a wire with electricity from a battery, and a compass needle just happened to be sitting nearby on the table.
Right. The classic story. He closes the circuit, current flows through the wire, and boom, the compass needle, which should be pointing north, suddenly deflects, swings towards the wire.
He opens the circuit, current stops, needle swings back. That was the spark, literally and figuratively. He recognized it instantly. This was the physical manifestation of the very link he'd been predicting for years.
Amazing moment.
And the text really emphasizes how quickly he followed up on this. He apparently dropped everything else, conducted a whole series of focused experiments over the next few months, and then published his findings. It was a brief paper, just 4 pages, but hugely impactful.
And that paper, detailing the effect of electric current on a magnetic needle, that's what brought him immediate international fame.
Yes, that discovery put him on the map, scientifically speaking.
Okay, so finding that electric current creates magnetism was monumental. That's the big discovery we all learned about in physics class. But here's where the author of this text introduces his central and, let's face it, quite controversial claim.
Right. The claim is that this wasn't the only significant thing Oersted figured out from that 1820 experiment. Maybe not even the most significant, according to this author.
What does he mean?
Well, the author points back to Oersted's philosophical and religious background again. Remember his deep faith. The text suggests Oersted took certain religious texts, specifically Christ's words about light in the Gospels, quite literally.
Literally how? Like the quote, "While you have the light, believe in the light that you may become sons of light."
Exactly. The author suggests Oersted saw this not just as an allegory, but as a statement about fundamental reality, that the fundamental substance, the prima materia, is this luminiferous matter light itself.
And that's the origin of everything. Hence, we are children of light.
That's the interpretation presented. And this, according to the author, solidified Oersted's conviction around 1821 that there is this deep, fundamental connection between light, electricity, and magnetism at the most basic level of reality.
Okay, interesting philosophical underpinning. But what about the second discovery the author claims was ignored or misunderstood? What was that?
It supposedly came directly from Oersted's detailed interpretation of the compass needle's specific behavior during that 1820 experiment. The text quotes Oersted noting a critical observation. The needle deflected one way when it was placed above the current-carrying wire, and it deflected the opposite way when placed below the wire.
Okay, opposite deflections above and below. What did Oersted conclude from that specific detail?
This was the key insight, according to the author. Oersted apparently concluded that this specific pattern, opposite effects on opposite sides of the wire, wasn't just some abstract force acting weirdly. He wrote explicitly in his paper that this kind of action, quote, at opposite ends of a diameter is characteristic of vortices.
Vortices. So he didn't just find a link between electricity and magnetism. He concluded the current was creating a literal vortex of matter swirling around the wire.
Exactly, a material vortex. That's the author's second discovery claim. And the text strongly connects this to Michael Faraday's later, very iconic demonstration using iron filings scattered around a current-carrying wire. You know the one. Figure 1 in the source shows it.
Oh yeah, the classic concentric circles the filings form.
Right. Those circular patterns are the textbook visual of a magnetic field, which, the author argues, perfectly illustrates what Oersted meant by a vortex. It looks like a vortex.
That is a striking connection. If a magnetic field pattern looks like a vortex, and Oersted apparently said it is a vortex based on his needle experiment, why did the mainstream scientific commentary quickly label his explanation mistaken, as the text quotes?
Well, that's the absolute core of the author's argument about suppression. He finds it highly improbable, almost suspicious, that the very person who correctly predicted the link and experimentally discovered it was somehow fundamentally wrong about the immediate observable nature of he saw that specific pattern of force around the wire.
So according to the author, dismissing Oersted's vortex finding wasn't just a simple scientific disagreement about interpretation.
No, he argues it was deliberate.
And his proposed reason is pretty dramatic. It was deliberate because the vortex idea strongly supported the existence of a pervasive, material, ether-filling space.
Precisely. And that concept, the author claims, was incredibly inconvenient, even threatening, to powerful forces controlling intellectual life, particularly in Europe at the time.
Which forces?
The text delves into this historical narrative, tracing the immense power of the Roman Catholic Church from the 13th century onwards. It highlights its control over knowledge, universities, its persecution of dissenters through things like heresy trials and witch hunts.
All aimed at maintaining a specific, approved understanding of God and reality, based largely on literal interpretations of the Old Testament.
Right. But the text explains that among educated people, especially during and after the Renaissance, a different understanding of the divine was emerging. Not some distant anthropomorphic figure in the sky, but God as an omnipresent spirit, an invisible, subtle substance of light, essentially, the ether.
This sounds like it resonates with concepts like the kingdom of heaven being everywhere and within us, perspectives found in sources like the Gospel of Thomas, which the author actually references.
Exactly. So seeing God as this pervasive divine substance, which is essentially what the ether represented in this philosophical view, was in direct conflict with the church's desire for a more controllable, distant, perhaps more easily institutionalized deity.
Okay, so the ether concept wasn't just physics. It had theological implications.
Deep ones, according to this text. And so the author argues the concept of a pervasive material ether, which supported this view of God as an immanent, everywhere spirit, became enemy number one for the church and its allies by the early 17th century. It fundamentally challenged their authority and their theological framework built on dogma.
How did they fight back against this idea?
To counter this ether-based worldview, the author introduces the philosophical movement of idealism. He specifically names Bishop George Berkeley in the early 18th century as a key figure. The text quotes Berkeley explicitly stating his goal was to deny the existence of material substance altogether. His famous line essentially was, "Matter is non-entity."
Deny matter itself. How?
Berkeley argued that the things we perceive, colors, sounds, smells, even the solidity of objects, don't exist independently as matter out there. They are merely sensations or ideas existing only in the mind, ours or God's.
Wow.
And according to the text, Berkeley presented this radical denial of matter as a way to dismantle atheism, which he claimed relied on the concept of matter as the fundamental reality.
So the philosophical war against the very existence of matter was linked, in this author's interpretation, to shoring up the church's narrative and authority.
Precisely. The author claims that hundreds of European professors, physicists, and philosophers actively promoted Berkeley's idealist philosophy specifically to support the church's power and control over people's understanding of reality. It was an intellectual campaign against materialism.
And then, centuries into this ongoing campaign to deny material substance, Oersted makes his discovery in 1820.
And crucially, according to the author, his second discovery, the vortex of matter swirling around the current carrying wire.
If Oersted found evidence of a material vortex,
then, according to the author, this was concrete experimental proof that a thin, invisible, pervasive material substance, the ether, does exist right there around the wire. It provides tangible matter precisely where the idealists, following Berkeley, claimed there was absolutely nothing but mind or sensation.
Which, in this narrative, made Oersted's finding a direct, almost undeniable threat to that whole idealist antimatter campaign. The text even quotes Oersted's logical reasoning for why it had to be a vortex again. Otherwise, it would be incomprehensible how the same part of the wire, placed under the magnetic pole of the needle, deflects it to the east, and when placed above the pole, attracts it to the west. It is characteristic of vortices to act in opposite directions at the two ends of a diameter.
His observation directly pointed to a specific physical mechanism, a vortex, which inherently requires a material medium. You simply can't have a vortex forming in completely empty space.
So the author's really explosive claim here is that Oersted finding a material vortex was so inconvenient, so threatening to the dominant philosophical and institutional powers aligned against materialism, that his explanation was quickly suppressed, sidelined, and labeled mistaken by scientific commentary, even though his core observation about the current magnetism link was accepted.
That's the crux of his argument about why Oersted's vortex idea disappeared from the mainstream narrative. It was too much evidence for the inconvenient ether.
That is quite a theory indeed. Okay, so moving forward chronologically in the text, it brings in James Clerk Maxwell. a giant in physics.
Absolutely. And the author presents Maxwell as someone who not only deeply believed in that fundamental connection Oersted sought between light, electricity, and magnetism, but used his incredible mathematical genius to actually prove it. He created the electromagnetic field theory.
And his major work was titled Electromagnetic Theory of Light, which kind of says it all, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests his focus, and the text emphasizes Maxwell's strong scientific arguments for the necessity of an ether. He wasn't just passively accepting an old idea, he saw it as required by the physics of light and heat transfer.
He needed it to make the math work, essentially.
More than that, to make the physics make sense. Maxwell argued, based on how light and heat travel, that there must be an ethereal medium, one that fills all space, permeates all bodies, and crucially, is capable of motion and transmitting energy through wave motion.
And the key part was how energy traveled.
Yes, he described energy alternating between different forms within the medium kinetic energy of motion and potential energy of elastic tension. The source includes a great quote from Maxwell's dynamic theory of the electromagnetic field about this.
Right, where he says the energy in the wave must have existed in the medium, equally divided between motion and tension.
He even cited work suggesting this medium must have a density comparable to ordinary matter. So for Maxwell, the existence of this pervasive medium with real physical properties like density and the ability to transmit motion and tension wasn't just theoretical fluff. It was a scientific necessity, supported by different branches of science.
So for Maxwell, the ether was absolutely fundamental for electromagnetic waves to even exist and carry energy across space. The text then briefly mentions André-Marie Ampere's work, which followed Oersted's discovery.
Right. Ampere discovered the mechanical forces between wires carrying currents. Parallel currents attract each other, anti-parallel currents repel. Basic electromagnetism.
And the author makes an interesting point here. He suggests that if Ampere had fully embraced Oersted's vortex idea,
he could have explained these interactions very simply, almost intuitively. The diagrams in the text, figure 3, are quite compelling on this point. They show two vortices swirling in the same direction next to each other. They visually seem to pull together.
And two vortices swirling in opposite directions look like they'd push each other apart.
Exactly. It makes the magnetic force feel incredibly tangible, doesn't it? It's not just some abstract field lines in empty space. It's literally two swirls of substance interacting mechanically.
Like eddies in water.
Precisely. The author argues these diagrams explain Ampere's findings with striking clarity, reinforcing the intuitive power of the ether vortex model. He states this classical view naturally leads to the conclusion that beneath the visible world, at the very origin of creation, there isn't the vacuum promoted by that antimatter campaign he described,
but rather a subtle cosmic medium, the ether.
And this, in the author's narrative, connects right back to those ancient Greek philosophers who spoke of ether, the upper air or pure essence, and also to those Renaissance scholars who saw this divine, subtle matter of light as the fundamental substance. The Heavenly Father, or Kingdom of Heaven described by Christ, present everywhere within us and around us.
The text even shares that powerful sonnet by Giordano Bruno, the one who was burned at the stake in 1600. He wrote of ascending through the field of ether to reach infinity.
The author uses Bruno's tragic story to really emphasize the high stakes involved in this historical battle against the concept of a material substance filling space. Burning scientists could eliminate individuals, perhaps, but the idea of a pervasive material ether, especially one intertwined with a different, more immanent view of the divine, persisted.
And this persistence, the author argues, is why the concept of material substance embodied by the ether remained enemy number one for those forces seeking to control understanding and maintain a specific worldview. The author's central claim is that the centuries-long struggle against the material ether didn't just fade away after the Renaissance. It continued and deeply influenced the trajectory of later physics.
Which leads him to draw a powerful, maybe provocative historical parallel.
What's the parallel?
The long, bitter battle between the geocentric, Earth-centered model of the solar system and the heliocentric, sun-centered model.
Ah, the classic science versus dogma conflict. The church and the academic establishment enforced the idea that the Earth was the fixed center for centuries, despite earlier evidence from ancient Greece, like Aristarchus, and certainly after the work of Copernicus.
They use dogma, yes, but the text points out they also use logical, common-sense arguments against the Earth moving. Remember those. If the Earth is spinning so fast, why don't birds get left behind when they take off?
Right. Or why does an object dropped from a tall tower fall straight down at the base instead of landing way behind the tower as the Earth rotates under it? They sound reasonable if you don't think too hard.
Exactly. And the text highlights the three scientists who challenged this entrenched view. Copernicus, who did the math putting the sun at the center; Bruno, who was martyred for passionately promoting the heliocentric view and the infinite universe of the public; and Galileo.
Galileo's role was crucial, wasn't it, in dismantling those common sense arguments?
The author argues, yes, absolutely crucial. The source quotes Galileo's famous theory of relativity. Well, his thought experiment involving observing phenomena below deck on a smoothly moving ship.
Right. The idea that inside the ship's cabin you can't tell if the ship is moving or still just by dropping things or throwing objects or watching flies buzz around. Everything inside the cabin shares the ship's motion perfectly.
And as the text points out, the simple, verifiable truth of this thought experiment completely disarmed those seemingly logical arguments against Earth's motion. Reason, based on observation and logical thought experiments, eventually won out, proving the sun was indeed at the center of our local system.
Okay, so that's the historical parallel. Now, the author makes a really bold leap here, doesn't he? He contends that science is currently in a similar state today, trapped by an entrenched, incorrect view, just like geocentrism was.
That's exactly his claim. According to the text, the modern turning point, the moment things went wrong again, was the early 20th century. He claims a group of idealist scientists, perhaps still influenced by that historical bias against material substance, seized upon the negative result of the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment.
The experiment designed to detect the ether wind, the effect of Earth moving through a stationary ether. And they famously didn't find it, or found a null result.
Right. And this negative result was then used, the author argues, essentially as justification to declare the ether non-existent and replace it entirely with the concept of physical vacuum, basically, empty space.
But the author is highly critical of that interpretation in that step.
Extremely critical. He makes a point of mentioning that later experiments, specifically citing Dayton Miller's extensive work in the 1920s, and even some later Michelson experiments in 1929, did reportedly find evidence of an ether wind, particularly at higher altitudes away from the Earth's surface drag.
And these positive results were?
According to the author, they were simply ignored, sidelined, or explained away by the scientific mainstream, which had already embraced the vacuum concept.
The text even includes that, quote, attributed to Einstein, saying the abolition of the ether allowed physicists to breathe a sigh of relief.
Yes, and the author interprets this quite pointedly. He suggests this group of Einsteinian physicists, as he terms them, had a vested interest, maybe subconscious, maybe not, in discarding the ether because it was inconvenient evidence. Evidence for a material substance filling space, which directly challenged their new vacuum-based paradigm and, the author implies, perhaps resonated with that lingering historical idealist agenda against matter.
So the author sees this dismissal of ether, despite later potentially positive experiments, as a direct parallel to the historical suppression of Oersted's vortex idea.
Exactly. Inconvenient evidence for a material ether Oersted's directly observed vortex pattern, the later Michelson-Miller results suggesting ether drift was dismissed or ignored, just as the mounting evidence for heliocentrism was dismissed for centuries before Galileo.
And this dismissal of the ether, and implicitly Oersted's material vortex, is what the author frames as the stone rejected by the builders, referencing Christ's parable.
Yes, he suggests this forgotten discovery, Oersted's material vortex, is the crucial missing piece, and that rejecting it has led modern physics down a convoluted path, struggling to explain fundamental phenomena that he argues could be quite simple if we just accepted the reality of the ether.
Which brings us right to the author's critique of how modern physics actually explains things like light and radio waves.
Right. The standard picture, the one taught in textbooks today, is that electromagnetic waves propagate perfectly well through empty space, through that physical vacuum that replaced the ether.
And the common textbook illustration, like the one shown as Figure 5 in the source text, usually depicts perpendicular electric E and magnetic B fields, often visualized as these sort of looping butterfly shapes oscillating together in phase and the whole pattern moving sideways.
Yes, E and B hitting maximum together, hitting zero together. And the author is quite blunt in his assessment of this picture. He calls this standard illustration and the accompanying explanation disinformation.
Disinformation. That's a very strong word in a scientific context. Why does he say that?
He raises several critical points based solely on the diagram and its usual description. First, the energy problem. How can these fields, which undeniably carry energy, just appear and disappear from nothing in empty space cycle after cycle? He argues this seems to violate fundamental principles like the conservation of energy. Where does the energy go when the fields hit zero? Where does it come from when they reappear?
Good question. What else?
Second, the vortex issue. He points out that the text accompanying these diagrams often mentions that the varying electric field creates a vortex magnetic field. But, he argues, the diagram itself, figure 5, does not actually show the magnetic field lines as closed loops, which are the absolute defining characteristic of a vortex field. They're shown as these open butterfly wing shapes that just fade out.
Okay, so the description says vortex magnetic field, but the picture doesn't actually show closed vortex loops.
Exactly. The author sees this as a key piece of visual misrepresentation, or at least a significant omission that obscures the true nature of the magnetic field according to classical understanding.
And he contrasts this sharply with Maxwell's original explanation, which were rooted firmly in the ether.
Yes. As the author interprets Maxwell, wave propagation isn't about fields popping into existence in a vacuum. It involves the continuous, alternate transformation of energy between different forms, kinetic energy of motion, and potential energy of elastic tension within the ether medium itself.
Back to that quote again.
Back to that quote. It's a continuous process of energy conversion happening in the substance of the ether, not fields magically appearing and disappearing simultaneously in empty space. The author argues Maxwell's view provides a tangible physical mechanism for the wave's existence and propagation, something he feels is completely absent in the standard vacuum model.
The author also takes aim at the typical explanation for how radio waves are actually emitted from something like a Hertz dipole antenna, right? The text in figure 7.
He does. He calls it empty reasoning. He points out that the standard description often talks about the electric and magnetic fields near the antenna, somehow detaching themselves from the oscillating charges and propagating off independently into space as a wave, usually beyond some arbitrary boundary a few wavelengths away.
And the problem with that is,
the author argues it doesn't actually explain what the wave is truly made of or how it's physically formed from the currents flowing in the antenna wires. It just describes a boundary and essentially says, and then magically it becomes a self-sustaining wave. It doesn't describe the mechanism of wave generation in the medium itself.
Okay, so how does the author's ether perspective offer a different explanation for wave emission and propagation?
Well, he goes right back to Lomonosov and, crucially, Oersted. The magnetic field is fundamentally the vortex motion of ether particles. This, he argues, naturally explains why magnetic field lines form closed loops. The particles are literally swirling in circles around the current.
Okay, standard magnetic field, ether vortex. But here's where he makes a really critical distinction, doesn't he? Connecting back to Orsted's original observation and potentially trying to resolve that apparent contradiction about the vortex depiction in modern diagrams.
Yes, this is a key part of his alternative proposal. He hypothesizes that different types of electric current might actually cause fundamentally different types of motion in the ether.
Different currents, different ether motions. How so?
He suggests that a slow, steady galvanic current, like the one Oersted probably used from his battery pile, creates the familiar, relatively slow vortex magnetic field, the one with closed loops, the one Oersted detected with his compass.
Okay, slow current, vortex motion. But what about the high-frequency, rapidly oscillating currents used to generate radio waves in a Hertz antenna? Or maybe even the processes creating light?
Exactly. High-speed currents, especially currents flowing mainly on the surface of a conductor where electrons move very fast, might be different. The author uses a really great analogy here. Think of a slow-moving fan blade. It creates a gentle, swirling breeze, a vortex, right?
Yeah.
But now think of a high-speed bullet fired through the air. It doesn't create a gentle swirl. It creates a shock wave, a powerful longitudinal compression wave pushing straight ahead.
Okay. So he's suggesting that these very high-speed surface currents, like in a radio antenna or maybe in atoms emitting light, don't primarily create slow vortex motion in the ether.
Exactly. He proposes they are much more likely to create elastic longitudinal deformations or waves in the ether. Waves that travel outwards like sound waves in air or water waves of compression and rarefaction moving in the direction of propagation.
Longitudinal waves in the ether. But that seems to immediately hit a major wall, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The big one.
Polarization. We know light and radio waves can be polarized. Polarization is the classic proof that light behaves like a transverse wave, where the oscillation is perpendicular to the direction the wave is traveling. How can longitudinal waves, like sound, be polarized?
That's the standard, very strong objection. And the text acknowledges this history. It quickly reviews the discovery of polarization, how light passing through certain crystals, like Iceland spar, or reflecting off surfaces at certain angles, behaves differently depending on orientation. Thomas Young, a major proponent of the wave theory of light, suggested back in 1817 that this polarization phenomenon absolutely required light waves to be transverse.
But that created its own problem for the ether theory back then, right?
It did. Because the ether was generally conceived as being a fluid-like medium, and fluids readily support longitudinal waves, compressions, but they strongly resist transverse waves, sideways shearing or wiggling. The question became, as the text puts it, what strings are there in the ether? How could a fluid transmit a sideways wiggle like a solid string? It was a major conceptual headache.
Okay, so how does the author propose to get around this? How does he reconcile longitudinal ether motion with observed polarization?
This is where he brings Orstead back into the picture in a surprising way. Remember, the author claims Oersted linked polarization specifically to vortex motion. And he also points out that Maxwell, even while developing his EM theory, viewed polarized light as involving transverse magnetic disturbances propagating in the ether. Figure 11 in the source shows this idea.
So even within the classical ether framework, the magnetic aspect was seen as somehow transverse, even if the underlying ether was fluid-like. But the author still has an issue with a purely vortex magnetic field explaining light, doesn't he?
Yes. He points out what he sees as a critical problem with explaining a narrow beam of light, like from a laser or just a focus beam, using only a vortex magnetic field. Because as we said, magnetic vortex lines are always closed loops. They have to circle back on themselves. How can you possibly have a beam of light with a finite width if the magnetic field lines that constitute it must necessarily loop back endlessly far outside the beam itself? The author argues this is geometrically impossible for a confined beam.
Okay, so the closed loops of a pure vortex field don't seem compatible with a narrow beam. So the author needs a way to have something transverse to explain polarization, related somehow to magnetism, but carried by a fundamentally longitudinal motion of the ether to fit his high-speed current idea. Yeah. And it needs to be confined to a beam, ruling out simple closed vortex loops. That sounds really tricky.
It definitely sounds complex, but the author proposes an alternative model, building on his core idea that high-speed currents create primarily longitudinal elastic waves in the ether. His hypothesis is that this process creates a fundamentally non-vortex type of magnetic field.
A non-vortex magnetic field. What does that even mean?
He suggests it consists of these longitudinal elastic waves propagating outwards, but the disturbances or structures within this longitudinal wave have characteristics that are effectively transverse to the direction of propagation, and these account for polarization.
How does he propose that works? Physically, what's oscillating transversely?
This is where the author introduces three specific hypothetical assumptions about the nature of the ether particles themselves. He draws partially on older ideas from Lomonosov and even Descartes here. First, he assumes ether particles move in an ordered way when subjected to force. Second, and this is absolutely key, he assumes they rotate around their own axis, perhaps similar to how electrons are understood to have intrinsic spin. Third, he suggests these rotating particles tend to line up into chains or filaments under certain conditions.
Okay, so we have tiny, spinning ether particles that can form chains.
Yes, and the author proposes that these ordered chains of spinning particles are the fundamental reality behind what we measure as magnetic field lines. But here's the critical difference from the classic vortex model. In his proposed model for a beam of light or radio wave, these magnetic lines, which are chains of rotating particles, are open. Their length is limited by the width of the beam or the extent of the wave front. They don't have to loop back endlessly outside the beam like vortex lines must.
Okay, let's try to visualize this again. Forget the slinky for a moment. Let's use this analogy. Imagine a line of tiny spinning tops, or gyroscopes, all arranged in a row, head to tail.
Perfect analogy. Now, the author's model says these particles forming the chain are actually moving forward in the direction the wave is propagating, like the whole line of tops is being pushed forward longitudinally.
Okay, so the chain itself moves forward, longitudinal motion.
But while they're moving forward, each individual top in the chain is also spinning rapidly around its own axis.
And the crucial part for polarization, the rotation axes are all aligned parallel to each other, but perpendicular to the direction the whole chain is moving forward.
Exactly. So the tops are rolling forward, longitudinal displacement of the chain, but they're simultaneously spinning sideways relative to that forward direction. The author claims these chains of forward-moving, sideways spinning particles are what constitute the magnetic field lines of a light or radio wave.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a mental picture. Forward motion of the particle chains, but the individual particles within those chains are rotating with their axes pointed sideways, all aligned. How does this setup create the electric and magnetic field effects we actually measure?
The author explains that this combination, the longitudinal motion of the chains and the intrinsic rotation of the particles within them, creates the effects we perceive and measure as magnetic and electric fields, mostly through induction effects when the wave interacts with matter, like an antenna or a detector.
And he shows a diagram, figure 13, that looks somewhat like the standard EMB wave diagram, figure 5, but he insists they're different.
Yes. He shows how, if you consider the magnetic field generated by these moving, rotating particle chains, and then add the induced electric field, which Faraday's law predicts would arise perpendicular to a changing magnetic field, the resulting graph of field strengths, figure 13, strongly resembles the standard textbook diagram, figure 5.
But he still calls figure 5 disinformation. So what's the fundamental difference in his view?
The author argues forcefully that his figure 13 is not a picture of the wave itself, the actual moving, spinning particle chains in the ether. Instead, he says it's merely a graph showing how the macroscopic magnetic and electric field strengths, which are consequences of the underlying particle motion and rotation, vary over time or distance within a polarized beam.
Whereas he claims modern physics textbooks misleadingly present figure 5 as a literal picture of the wave itself, showing fields existing independently in empty space, rather than just a graph of field effects resulting from an underlying medium.
Precisely. His model has the moving, rotating substance, the ether particle chains, and his diagram, Fig 13, is just a representation of the measurable fields resulting from that substance's complex motion. The standard diagram, Figure 5, he argues, incorrectly presents the fields themselves as the fundamental reality, existing without any need for an underlying medium.
Okay. He also points to another property of his proposed longitudinal light waves, shown in figure 14. What's going on there?
Figure 14 illustrates that in his model, there are actual longitudinal compressions and expansions in the density of the ether particles as the wave propagates. And importantly, the net direction of the ether particle motion, the longitudinal drift of the chains, is always away from the source of the light, regardless of the direction of the current that created it.
So the wave is always pushing outwards. What about the positive and negative parts of the wave cycle in this model?
In his model, the negative and positive halves of the wave cycle don't represent fields flipping direction in empty space. Instead, they differ only in the direction of the ether particle rotation around their axes, say clockwise versus counterclockwise relative to the direction of propagation.
And this continuous outward longitudinal motion and compression has another important consequence.
Yes, it naturally explains light pressure. Maxwell had calculated theoretically that light should exert a physical pressure, and Pyotr Lebedev experimentally proved it around 1899.
Right.
If light is literally a beam of substance, ether particle chains, moving longitudinally outwards from the source, even with internal rotation, it would inherently push on anything it hits, just like when a moving medium pushes a sail. The author argues this is a direct, tangible, intuitive consequence of his longitudinal ether wave model, unlike the more abstract explanations required in modern physics based on momentum transfer by massless photons in a vacuum.
Okay, let's talk about energy more directly. Modern physics certainly accepts that the magnetic field itself carries kinetic energy.
Yes, density of magnetic energy is a standard concept.
So if the magnetic field has kinetic energy, the author argues, it must have mass associated with it. Via EMC2, even classically, inertia is related to energy. And according to the author, that mass must ultimately come from the ether particles that constitute the field in his model.
Exactly. He argues you can't have kinetic energy without mass inertia, and if there's mass, there must be substance in the ether particles. He then brings back the idea of the ether particle rotation being key to understanding energy differences in light. He references Descartes, who apparently had an intuition that different colors of light might correspond to different rotational speeds of the underlying particles.
And the author argues this old idea aligns beautifully with Alexander Stolitov's experiments on the photo effect in the late 19th century.
Yes, Stolitov's crucial finding was that different colors, different wavelengths of light clearly carried different amounts of kinetic energy, demonstrated by their ability to eject electrons from a metal surface. UV light, with its shorter wavelength, had enough energy to kick electrons out, while red light, even if very intense, often didn't, regardless of brightness. This was a key puzzle that eventually led Planck and Einstein towards the quantum concept of photons, where energy is proportional to frequency.
Right, but the author's ether model offers, in his view, a much simpler, more mechanical explanation for Stolitov's results.
That's his claim, he argues. If the linear speed of the ether particle chains moving forward in the waves is constant for all colors, it has to be, it's the speed of light, roughly 300,000 kilometers, then the only way different wavelengths of light can carry different amounts of kinetic energy is if the individual ether particles themselves are rotating at different speeds around their axis.
Okay, so in his model, shorter wavelength light, like ultraviolet, corresponds to the ether particles spinning faster, thus having higher rotational kinetic energy. Longer wavelength light, like red, means the particles are spinning slower, resulting in lower rotational kinetic energy.
That's precisely his argument. He presents this as the simplest, most logical explanation, one that's consistent with both the wave nature, the longitudinal propagation of the chains, and the particle-like aspect, the energy being localized in the rotation of the individual ether particles.
And he contrasts this quite starkly with how he portrays the modern explanation, which relies on quantum mechanics and EMC2 operating within a vacuum.
Yes, he argues that to explain the energy difference between different colors of light without invoking a material medium, modern physics is forced to imagine a vacuum filled with discrete energy packets, or quanta photons, that somehow have different intrinsic energies, often visualized, as in his figure 15, as being different sizes or having different effective masses. He finds this concept of massless particles carrying different inherent energies in empty space absurd.
He claims this quantum explanation requires arbitrarily assigning different energy values, and thus effective masses via EMC2, to these energy packets in empty space, without providing any underlying physical mechanism within a medium, like his proposed particle rotation, to account for why the energy differs. He sees his rotation-based explanation as far more grounded, mechanical, and intuitive.
It's definitely a very different way of conceptualizing light energy.
Wow. Okay. So to try and wrap up the author's really comprehensive and quite challenging argument presented in this source text, he fundamentally believes that Oersted's claimed second discovery, the observation interpreted as a material vortex around an electric current, is crucial, direct experimental evidence for the existence of a universal ether.
And he argues that what he calls official science, perhaps still subtly influenced by those historical, anti-materialist, philosophical, and institutional forces dating back centuries, continues to ignore or dismiss this evidence and the whole ether concept, choosing instead to maintain a vacuum-based model that he views as overly abstract, counterintuitive, and unnecessarily complex in explaining many phenomena.
He uses that geocentric versus heliocentric shift as a powerful historical precedent, doesn't he? Suggesting that science can indeed get stuck in a fundamentally wrong paradigm for long periods, sometimes influenced by non-scientific factors, but that eventually truth based on reason and observation tends to prevail.
Yes, that's the parallel he draws. And based on this conviction, his call to action in the text is quite clear. He urges open-minded physicists, engineers, and even enthusiasts to publicly discuss and work towards the rehabilitation of the world ether and its eventual return to the foundations of physics.
And he notes he worked on refining this text over several years, from 2002 to 2007, implying these arguments represent a considerable period of thought and synthesis on his part.
It's certainly a consistent and elaborately constructed alternative viewpoint.
It really is a powerful, sweeping, quite controversial narrative presented in this text. We've journeyed from ancient curiosity about invisible forces, through a pivotal moment of accidental discovery, deep into centuries of philosophical and institutional conflict over the nature of reality, and landed squarely on a fundamental critique of modern physics' most basic assumptions about light, energy, and space itself.
It definitely forces you to pause and consider the possibility that some of the fundamental assumptions we often take for granted might be incomplete, or maybe that the history of science isn't quite as straightforwardly progressive as the standard textbooks sometimes make it seem. There are always twists and turns and perhaps forgotten paths.
Exactly. And reflecting on this deep dive, maybe ask yourself, does the author's proposed ether-based explanation for things like light pressure or the energy differences in the photo effect via particle rotation, does that feel more intuitively satisfying or mechanically plausible to you than the standard explanations involving abstract fields in a vacuum or massless quanta with inherent energy?
Or does, considering this historical context, the author's narrative about long-standing philosophical battles against the very concept of matter, does that change how you view the development of modern science at all? Does it make you wonder if non-scientific factors could have influenced the directions physics took, as the author strongly argues?
The text makes a very bold claim that a forgotten idea, an observation dismissed early on as mistaken, might actually be the missing cornerstone for a new physics. A physics that could potentially explain the universe with greater simplicity and elegance by bringing back the concept of a tangible medium filling space.
It's a radical thought.
It is. So here is a final provocative thought for you to ponder, drawing right from the heart of the source material we've explored today. If space isn't truly empty void, if it is instead filled with a subtle, dynamic material ether, as this author contends based on his interpretation of historical clues and experimental results, what truly radical implications could that have?
Beyond just light and magnetism.
Exactly. What could it mean for our understanding of gravity, of quantum mechanics, of the fundamental structure of reality itself? Could this stone rejected by the builders, this idea of a material ether, perhaps revealed by Oersted's Vortex, truly hold the key to unlocking new, maybe even simpler secrets of the cosmos?
It's certainly a question that pushes the boundaries of current thinking. A lot to consider there.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for bringing this incredibly fascinating and thought-provoking source text to us, and thank you for joining us on this, well, exceptionally deep dive today.
My pleasure. It was a challenging but stimulating exploration.
We genuinely hope it's given all of you listening some valuable nuggets of knowledge, maybe challenged some assumptions, and definitely sparked your own curiosity to perhaps look a little differently at the seemingly empty space all around you. Thanks for tuning in.